past 170 years, schools across the United Nations and the world have been targeted and visited by UFOs. These are not just simple flyovers. In these cases, the objects hover for long periods of time at extremely low elevation, often landing next to the schools. In many cases, humanoids are seen, and on the very rare occasions, they have a message to share, just as they did in Zimbabwe in 1994.
In the case of many apparent encounters with alien beings, it's easy for some people to try to discount this case or that case because they don't like the quality of the evidence, or they don't think the witnesses are believable, or what have you. But there's several cases where it's really hard to make that objection. One of them, in my opinion, happened in the nation of Zimbabwe on September 16, 1994, in a town called Ruwa, which is pretty close to the capital of Zimbabwe, Harare. And this is where you've got 62 school children at a place called the Ariel Elementary School, who on recess, this is in the morning of September 16th, have an encounter that I don't see how we can really discount this one. So they're on a recess. All of the teachers and nearly all of the adults are inside doing administrative work. There's one adult, one of the mothers, is out there operating a kind of food stand. It's not clear how much she participated in this sighting. We've got 62 kids out there, ages from as young as 5, but up to 12, 13 years of age as well. And all of them were adamant about what they then saw. About 3 objects moving around the sky that didn't look like airplanes, didn't look like anything that they could identify. One of them landed in an uncleared area where the kids were not supposed to go to, about 100 meters away from them. They saw this landed craft. They described it all as like a flying saucer, essentially. And they noticed a number of beings, short little beings, that were associated with this. One of them was actually standing on top of the craft. They had large black wraparound eyes. They really were described as classic gray aliens. Now, it's kind of a strange encounter because you get the idea that these beings either would appear in certain areas or would move very rapidly from one area to another. But at one point, one of these short beings came toward the kids and in fact got as close to a few of them as almost the ability to shake their hand if they desired to do that. It was a very, very close encounter. I spoke to one of these witnesses. They're now all grown up, of course. But as a little 8-year-old girl, she distinctly saw this creature standing maybe 5, 6 feet away from her, maybe even closer. She was with one of her friends who was standing right next to her, and there was a whole bunch of kids in the vicinity who saw this encounter. It's a very, very strange thing because a number of these kids said that they received a distinct mental impression from these beings. And the impression had something to do with a fear of how human beings were damaging the global environment and how they were concerned for the future, this type of thing. An environmental type of a message, basically, is what was coming through. It's also unclear how this whole scenario ended, but apparently the craft at some point just lifted up and left, and these children run into the school to tell what they had just seen. The adults honestly had no idea of how to respond to this, but the fact that these kids were so adamant, so serious, caused the headmaster to tell all the kids to draw what they had seen. And there was about 35 drawings or so that these children had created, and they are remarkably similar. Beings are all drawn in pretty much the same way. That is, small, thin beings with those large black eyes, kind of a slit for mouth, if a mouth at all, no ears, what you would expect from descriptions of the classic gray alien. There was a South African UFO researcher at the time, a lady by the name of Cynthia Hind, probably South Africa's leading UFO researcher back in those days. And she very quickly was able to get to the school. She interviewed these children herself, was very impressed by them. All of the teachers, all of the administrators equally were really quite convinced that these kids were not lying. It so happened that the American abduction researcher, Dr. John Mack of Harvard University, was able to go to this place shortly after that. He went with an assistant who was able to film him, to record him interviewing these children. Basically, Mack went in, because he was a psychologist, he was able to counsel these children on their experience. A lot of these kids were kind of traumatized by it, without a doubt. He was able to talk with them, but also was able to get them calmly to describe to him their encounters and what they saw and what they felt in this whole situation. And again, the responses were incredibly consistent. One of the things that stands out about this, because the video of that interview does exist and it's available for us to see, is how serious-minded these young children were and how impressive they actually were. These were children who clearly were very serious-minded and who were quiet, who were sincere, who were adamant about what they had seen. It's one thing to dismiss the claims of a single lone individual who said that they had an encounter, no matter how serious or believable they are. But how do you do that with 62 kids? And you know, the oldest ones of these were 12, 13 years of age. They weren't young children who didn't know any better. One of the difficulties arising from this whole encounter was how the children and their parents frequently interpreted this encounter. Turns out there was a very, very strong religious component to the school and to the beliefs of especially many of the families, the parents of these kids, who believed very strongly that these children had encountered a kind of demonic entity or demonic activity. And so a lot of these kids were very strongly encouraged not to pursue this, not to talk about it, basically to put it out of their mind. And so what happens over the years is that a lot of these kids, as they grew up, tried to reject the encounter altogether or put it out of their mind and not talk about it. Others, however, just really have not been able to do that. Fortunately for us, a large number of these kids, they're now in their 30s, are very willing to talk about the experience. And, you know, we're now looking 25 plus years after the fact, and they're standing by what they experienced way back in 1994. They are convinced that this was a landed craft. They are convinced that several alien beings came out to encounter them directly. There are things about this whole experience that I'm not sure if there will ever be fully nailed down, fully made, completely concrete so that we can know exactly what happened minute by minute by minute. But what is very clear is that something happened. Something real and tangible happened on those school grounds that affected these children so deeply. The drawings that they provided are just riveting, in my opinion. The drawings not only of the craft, but of the beings themselves. And again, the messages. This message of, you know, the environment, be careful with the environment, you're damaging it. Humanity is doing terrible things to the environment. I've often asked myself, why these children? Why did this happen in a situation where adults were not able to confirm or corroborate the encounter? And I don't really have an answer to that. We don't have a direct line to ask these beings these types of questions to find out why this happened the way it did. Part of me wonders, is it that they just were able in this moment, due to things that we can't even figure out, to make an appearance here? Is it a case where these were extraterrestrial beings that just decided to land here for some reason and by accident encountered these kids without expecting to or without planning to? Or was this a planned operation? Did they do this with every intention to communicate with these children? And were they extraterrestrial, or were they from some other veil beyond our normal reality, where they were able to come into our reality due to some anomaly that we're not even aware of, maybe like a magnetic anomaly in the Earth or some other thing that allowed this craft to appear the way it did? We don't really know any of these answers. The problem with the UFO phenomenon, one of so many problems, is that it doesn't behave the way we would like it to behave. It doesn't behave in the logical, linear fashion that we would just love, so that we can make perfect sense out of everything that goes on here. The fact that you've got this apparently incredibly advanced technology, these very unusual beings, and they appear before school children who are old enough to know what they're looking at, but they're not really old enough to grasp the full enormity of the situation of what was going on right in front of them. Like, why? Why? Well, again, we have lots of questions. We don't have all the answers we would like. One thing that definitely is the case is that these kids have been affected for their entire lives by this event. Processing something like that seems to me something that they'll never be able to fully do to their satisfaction, I'm sure. There'll always be these unanswered questions that they have. Why them? Why these beings? Why did this happen when it happened? Why couldn't we get more information from them at the time that it happened? When I think of how these beings appeared to move, it makes me think that there was a possible memory wipe that was going on. After all, you've got a being that's over here, and then all of a sudden, without any warning, it seems to be over here. It's like they moved almost instantaneously. Now, is it that they moved instantaneously for real, or is this all that the children remembered? Again, more questions, not a lot of answers. But again, I keep coming down to the reality of something that did happen, something that's vivid, something that's powerful, profound, that affected over 60 kids. That's amazing to me. There's one really good takeaway from the Rua, Zimbabwe aerial school encounter that is worth remembering, which is that this was not a negative encounter with these apparent alien beings. It was actually a pretty positive encounter. Yes, the children were frightened by it. The children were distressed by it. I mean, that's not surprising at all. But when you look at the larger scenario here, you have a situation where these beings were clearly very gentle. They weren't acting in an aggressive way. It was an encounter. It was a face-to-face encounter between young, innocent, intelligent, good children and these beings. I mean, a mental connection that took place there between our species and another species. When you think of it in that context, it's really an extraordinary event, and one that might actually give us cause for some hope in the future in terms of how we might be able to relate to each other.
From this perspective, the Rua UFO incident is consistent with other UFO experiences around the world, where UFO experiencers and abductees report being abducted and receiving information about the state of our planet and mankind's role within it from their encounters with various different types of entities. On this occasion, just as others, we hope such visions were not prophetic in any shape or form.